All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you're in the right place. You've been watching the president. This is blockchain and enabling technologies. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm with Reuters. It's been I want to give a few words of introduction to set the context, if I could, and then we'll get straight into our discussion. You know, it's been very hard, of course, to stay away from the debate surrounding the sustainability of bitcoins and other crypto assets. Plenty of supporters, plenty of detractors, as we watch the prices of these assets fluctuate violently. We watched it gain a mention in a G20 communique earlier this year. We also watched it become a regular feature of most financial broadcasters' live ticker displays. Apparently the price of Bitcoin is now as watched as sterling and the US dollar. The blockchain, of course, refers, and I probably don't need to tell you this, but refers to the technology that sits behind all of these cryptocurrencies, and it's that technology that we want to talk about today. Most of us will be aware of its uses in the financial sector, for securitization, for transacting, etc. But importantly, the potential of blockchain is increasingly being explored and mined beyond this sector in the delivery of aid, for example, in the creation of more efficient and safer supply chains and the delivery of all manner of public services. Anything really, I think, that relies on digital record keeping. And our panel can explore all of these bits and pieces today, and we then want to come to you for your questions. We're running pretty tight on time, so I'm going to keep it as snappy and as interactive as I can. Happily, I don't need to explain to you all how the blockchain works, because we've got a handy video to do that for us, courtesy of MIT Technology Review. Let's run that video, and then we'll start our discussion.
The internet can send baby photos and cat videos across the globe instantly, but many important things still move slowly. It can take days to send money across borders, for example. Banks must rely on middlemen to check transactions are valid. Blockchains might get important stuff moving faster by helping organizations work together more easily. A blockchain is a digital record or ledger, like a database. It can securely store and verify data about the world, like who owns money or property. Built-in cryptography ensures that only people authorized to do so can make changes to the data. Blockchains can be operated by many people or organizations working together. A shared secured system makes it easier for companies to collaborate than when data is stuck inside walled-off private databases. Digital currency Bitcoin is built on a blockchain powered by thousands of computers around the world. Anyone can use Bitcoin software to send or receive payments. No bank required. Companies are now adopting blockchain-style systems to make transferring real money around the world faster. And blockchains can help move more than just money. They might make electronic health records more portable, for example. If health providers jointly operate the blockchain, it could be easier for patients to transfer their records from place to place. The security features of blockchains could aid detection of errors in patient files. Government and organizations like the UN are also investigating how blockchains could have humanitarian applications, like providing financial infrastructure for people not served by banks.
All right, there you have it. A lot better than I could have explained it. Let me introduce the panel. Next to me is Renata Avila, Senior Digital Rights Advisor at the World Wide Web Foundation with a specialty in intellectual property and technology. Much of her work, correct me if I'm wrong, it addresses the intersection, of course, between human rights and technological change. Welcome, Renata. Nick Carey, as President and founder of Blockchain, the Bitcoin software company, not the technology, based in London, often described as a serial entrepreneur and a lifelong technologist, a regular at this event as well. Next to Nick is Pierre Dijonnet, co-founder of the Reconnect program in France. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but Reconnect bills itself as an online storage and sharing platform that boosts social care, basically an app that allows homeless people to keep their personal documents, and I believe it's available in France and Canada now, Pierre. And last but not least is Wolfgang Jammann, Executive Director of the International Civil Society Centre, a group that supports civil society organizations. Before that, he was with CARE International, very much a leading voice in the humanitarian and conflict management spaces. So welcome to all of you. Nick, I'm going to come to you just on the back of that video. Was it a good depiction of where we are with blockchain? And let me add this question: are you surprised by I don't know if we can call it growing skepticism about blockchain and cryptocurrencies and crypto assets? Are you surprised by that, and could that be detrimental to trying to get this thing working for other sectors?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there are now people who spend their entire careers trying to explain what a blockchain is all over the world. And so I actually think we've come a pretty long way from where we started 8.5 years ago in the industry. The way I like to describe it, and I think this has been something that's been helpful for me, is I think of it basically as a big spreadsheet in the cloud. But instead of there being one copy of this spreadsheet, there are copies of it all over the world. And when someone makes an entry or records some precious information into it, it's impossible to remove it, and anyone on Earth can actually write instructions into this thing. And so it has some properties that make it very useful for storing information. And the very first application that was sort of envisioned using this technology was to use it for peer-to-peer cash. And that was the Bitcoin project, which continues to run today and has been a very, very compelling use case for it. But it's kind of just the first one. Once you have this medium, this new capability of storing information in an immutable way, meaning it can't be counterfeited and can't be removed, you can use this technology for lots of other use cases. So I'm excited to explore some of those tonight because we have the ability now to wrap the whole planet in an economic fabric that makes it possible for all people to send, receive, secure, and exchange valuable information. That information may represent financial assets, it may represent property, it may represent personal identifying information. And so one of the things that a lot of people up here are going to be interested in sharing with you is how they're applying this technology across a ton of different sectors.
Forgive me for putting it like this, Nick, but I've got to play devil's advocate. That's the marketing pitch, and of course that's the pitch we're going to get from you. What about blockchain is a slow, energy-efficient dinosaur that won't live up to the hype? A quote from somebody whose name begins with an R, ends in I, and he's called Dr. Doom.
So yeah, that guy's just some random person on the internet. Okay, so a common criticism right now is that blockchains are computationally expensive and they require a lot of energy to run, and that is a fair criticism. But I would also launch back that the cost of maintaining trust in the world is exceedingly high. If you think about the cost of constructing Canary Wharf for Wall Street, and just to do basic things like move money around the world, the financial services sector invests billions and billions of dollars. It is terrible for the environment, it wastes tons of energy, and it can't do simple things like move a transaction from Paris to New York in a timely fashion. And so, to me, we're not going to invent a better financial future for the world by slowly iterating on the past, right? We didn't invent the light bulb by tinkering with the candle. We invented something new that was 100% better, and that is where we are today. Now, I'll point out that this is an exponential technology. It's still in its early days. We've achieved less than 1% penetration globally of people using this in a regular way in their lives. But we are making huge inroads, and every few years this thing doubles in size. And as that continues to happen, it will become eventually so ubiquitous that we will kind of forget what it was like before it existed.
With your lawyer's hat on, how careful do we need to be when we look at the way this might be used for all manner of things? How careful do we need to be?
Well, I will first of the lawyer hat. I think that the women. I think that as you can see in this panel, I mean, this is the reality, if not even a darker reality on these technologies. And that it's about power at the end of the day. It's a technology that is the knowledge, the power, the leading industry is concentrated in a tiny little group of men from the north, from jurisdictions that you can count with one hand. And that's a problem. And that's a problem when you think about the legal implications. Of course, those with power will shape the law and shape the institutions that will govern the technology. And I think that we failed again. And I feel that we fail again to women, and I think that we fail again to truly designing a system that can bring more people in and that can distribute power. And
you think we failed again from the outset, but how quickly can we wrest this back, do you think?
I think that we can. Still, it's at a very early stages of technology, and I don't like to allocate blame, but I think that the media have played a tremendously damaging role in asking the wrong questions and pushing the wrong headlines. I think that we are still in the exploratory phase, and I think with corrective measures and investment from the state, we can get up to speed, and we can at least correct some of the tremendous inequalities that this concentration of power can lead to.
All right. Wolfgang, let me bring you in here. On the back of what Renata's just said on exploring, is that, clearly, as I said in the open, one of your expertises is the humanitarian sector, how we can use technology like this to help in aid, for example. Is there a danger that we're going to run before we can walk here?
Yeah, thanks for taking my tagline. I think what Renata has just said is a great point. We have a technology, and let's just take a step back before we think about how to apply this. What's happening here? We have a technology like many other technologies around the fourth industrial revolution that come across us, and that technology is rapidly developing, and we're scrambling. We're trying to figure out what do we do with it. And it's very different from how we were trying to deal with problems years or decades back, where you have a problem and then you try to find a solution, right? At the moment, we have technologies, we have things happening around digital, where we really don't know both what can we use it for and what does it bring. And one of the dangers that it brings is, for instance, exclusion. We know that digitalization is not neutral. It requires capacity, understanding, it requires internet access. We have a technology here which brings the dangers of further exclusion, whether it's women, whether it's poor people and the like. And there's a couple of things here which we have to figure out before we get all excited. Some of those things have to do with similar 30 years ago when the internet came up, when we all thought, that's something strange and something new. And we did not engage in figuring out the dangers and the opportunities of the internet in terms of governance structure, in terms of power that is behind that. Because blockchain is not a technology that is per se neutral. There's actors behind that. Blockchains are being developed by people with money, by governments and the like. So I think we need to get our head around this technology rather than jumping into it and say, what do we do with it?
But when you hear the likes of, I think it's the World Food Program using a Ethereum-based currency asset to distribute aid, etc. What do you think? Are they jumping in foolishly too quickly?
No, I think it's good, that we're in this experimental field. I mean, the World Food Program does that, UNHCR. Ethereum is a commercial kind of currency. There's again someone behind this. So if you use something like that, you better figure out, with whom are you working. This experimental field is nice, but we must not forget that we need to get our head around what does it mean and what dangers and what opportunities does it bring. You've mentioned the ecological dimension. Inclusion is a big one. Again, power shift, imbalances. So I think what we're trying to do, and to be more concrete, in our context with our organizations, we're trying to develop some guidelines, some handles, some ethical standards and the like, which is a little bit overlooked with all the hype around blockchain.
Okay, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I would actually challenge some of this because I think, and I definitely believe that there are technological inequalities that which will cause some significant unintended consequences, and I don't want to trivialize those. But the design principles behind how these technologies get built are significantly different than how other software has been created. And so we're dealing right now with huge questions about platform plays in the world, right? How does our information get used? Do we still have sovereignty over data and advertisers and all those things? And those are powerful questions that need to be addressed. The blockchain technologies are mostly designed and built by collaborative open source communities. Now, if you go to the GitHub repository, which is the open instruction set for things like Bitcoin or Ethereum, you can see code contributions done by men, by women, by people from nearly every continent, every country in the world. It is harnessing the collective wisdom and intelligence of people all over the planet. The whole point of this technology was to democratize and decentralize trust and risk. And so I'm a little confused by the narrative that we're talking about up here. I don't think that there aren't potential unintended consequences, but at the design stage of this, we're talking at the very beginning about using and building something that doesn't care what color your skin is, where you were born, what your gender is, or what your credit score looks like. Now, you may not have access to the internet, and that will deny you the ability to take advantage of these tools. Now, when I think about the role of governments, it will often be right now, how do we serve our end users better, our citizens? And right now, we have tons of opaque optics into the institutions that govern the world. What if we had better voting tools? What if we had better ways of graphing the financial transactions these institutions use? So, like, to me, I think we should be optimistic about some of these things because we are taking them into consideration as we build the software.
All right. Look, I'm going to come back to a few of those points. Pierre, just talk to us about how you're using it, how it's helped the Reconnect platform. I mean, it's the basis of the Reconnect platform, I think, but also talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that you've faced. Because all this sounds great on paper, and again, I apologize, I'm playing devil's advocate here. It all sounds great on paper, but until something bad happens, we are going to be sailing this way.
Okay, so the social issue we are trying to address is that excluded population have difficulties to prove their identity and to access to basis humans services. I mean, if you do not have a way to prove your identity, you cannot access to a bank account, you cannot access to a mobile communication, you cannot access to specifically to social benefits. The key is to bridge those social benefits and the people, the beneficiaries of those social benefits. And actually, we are addressing the homeless population in France, and it's reaching the million of people in France today. And 40% of that population do not access to any social benefits because their administrative records are incomplete. And there is huge consequences on the pathway of that population, those beneficiaries, but there is huge consequences also on the NGO that trying to address that population, that provide accommodation, that provide healthcare programs and social services. And they spend too much time on finding just one paper or just one piece of identification for their beneficiaries instead of working on what is essential, which is seeking housing, seeking a better accommodation, or seeking for a job.
And you couldn't do this without this technology.
Exactly. We are using the blockchain for a specific application. We want to certify the documents we store on the platform. To describe quickly what we do, we provide to the population a secure account where they can store everything they need from their papers, their documents, their appointments, each information they need for their social insertion. And it's important to understand also that this population is connected. Half of our users are connecting on our website with a mobile device. So the technology is here, there is usage. And what we want to do is to ensure that the document we store on the platform are not modified. And if an NGO create a document and put it on the cloud of the beneficiaries, we want to ensure that the document is real, created by an NGO, and who owns the document, ensure that finally the NGO that provides, for example, the food aid will accept the document. So we are exploring that technology for that.
Okay, Renata, you look a little skeptical.
Yes, I think that we are still, again, in the exploratory phase, and I think that there's many of these things that can be done low-tech and as good. And one example is if the local communities or the local government cannot, if they don't have people inside capable of dominating the technology, then the startup can vanish. It can go. Like, there's many social factors that made these solutions really experimental and not reliable still. We are still in early phase for solutions. And there's some things, for example, this for refugees is an interesting solution, but there's some characteristics in the blockchain that worry some women rights advocates. For example, pieces of revenge porn into the ledger that you cannot delete ever. That's a real thing. It's just an example of nightmare scenarios on this technology with social implications. And something that I wanted to say as well is in Honduras, there was a case that wanted to implement a blockchain for the local registry of a land registry. If you understand the history of Latin America and the history of small countries in Latin America, then it will have, the meaning of that will be like the crystallization forever of an unfair system that is full of flaws. So maybe sometimes we need to go one step back and go to the social and historical roots of what we want to crystallize.
Okay. Nick, I want you to come back on this because you released this white paper that I think the future is decentralized, right? And I know you're interested in the land rights issue that Renata was just talking about. How would you respond to those concerns? And what do you think is the greatest weakness of this technology?
Sure. So we recently released a white paper called The Future is Decentralized, and you can get it at blockchain.com/research. We worked with UNDP, UNHCR, leading academics at a bunch of different universities around the world to look at the use of blockchain technology to achieve faster delivery against the Sustainable Development Goals. So we looked at a bunch of different in-production case studies right now where the technology is being used and everything from development aid effectiveness, moving money to market through large institutions, to property rights, to digital identity, to energy markets, and a few other use cases as well, remittances included. So those are just a few of the use cases and examples. And we'll be hosting an event at the United Nations on June 4th. As one of the founding commissioners for the Blockchain Commission for Sustainable Development, we're going to be exploring 12 different work streams that are going to be pretty interesting, I think, completely outside of financial services. So in terms of specifically some of the concerns around where we're not fulfilling on the potential, one of the biggest issues we have right now is scale. And that's a big problem because these technologies by design are actually kind of inefficient. If you have to coordinate instructions across a computer system that's global, you deal with latency and it's very computationally expensive. And so some of the most advanced research that's being done right now is to figure out how to make this work for more people very, very quickly. And we're not there yet, to be candid. But some of the best people in the world are working on these things in the academic sector, and those things have long-term payoffs. And we'll have to stumble till we get there. And I think it's true that this is definitely a nascent and emergent technology, but we have proved for 8 years that it is able to do certain things really, really well, which is certify information in an immutable way. And for some use cases, that's really good. There are use cases where that doesn't make sense. And for small countries that are trying to bring land rights and property rights into a formal regime, that's tricky. Like if you get garbage into one of these systems, you will crystallize a legacy of poor land management. And I don't necessarily have the right answer for how to approach that in an interdisciplinary way, but here's the potential. There are trillions of dollars of undocumented property rights around the world. And if we can get people access to prove the things that they own, they can get things like collateral, and that can improve their ability to form businesses and return money back to their families and build a more sustainable economy around the planet. And part of the most important thing there is to prove what you actually own. And so what the blockchain is capable of doing is building a pathway toward a property rights fabric for the planet. Now, jurisdictionally, that's going to be very tricky, and there are a lot of complicated local problems to deal with, especially markets where there hasn't been strong trust in institutions in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Wolfgang, come in on the back of that, because clearly this is an area that you're involved in as well. And actually turning it around, when we look at aid and big NGOs and the charity sector, we're not talking just about money tracking here. We're talking about clarity, we're talking about transparency, we're talking about rooting out mismanagement in the charity sector, and the blockchain is actually pretty good at that, right?
No, yeah, I think it's a terrific tool, to increase transparency and accountability. It can do away with the costs of the middleman. I mean, it can create trust. You know, once, let's say, both sides of the blockchain master the technology, the donor and the recipient, if you wish. You know, so there's capacity issues involved. And I think what the examples that have been mentioned, both by Nick and Pierre, I love it. I think there's great potential. When you look at identities, this is not just about homeless people in France. There's 1 billion people in the world who don't have an identity in form of, you know, an ID card, a passport, anything that is reliable, because their governments are either not providing that or not taking the responsibility. Now, of course, in theory, blockchain can and should help with this. In practice, we have issues of scale, and all the excitement that is out there needs to take this into account. Scale is not just scaling up numbers, it's also bringing those 1 billion people into that space that blockchain potentially provides. And then, please let us not be naive that a potential of a technology, you know, leads automatically to the right thing. There's, you know, you find 200, 300 initiatives that call themselves blockchain for good in one way or the other at the moment, and they're rapidly growing. And I believe there's a lot of genuine, you know, great stuff and intentions behind that. But let's not take this for granted. I mean, you know, Mr. Zuckerberg 10, 15 years ago said, you know, we have reinvented the telephone. We have a beautiful platform that's called Facebook. It's advertisement free. There's never anything happening with it. And now we have Cambridge Analytica. And, you know, I don't want to be waking up, or any of us, you know, in 3-4 years' time, it won't take 15, where we have the Cambridge Analytica around blockchain.
Do you worry about that, Nick?
So when I think about the potential in the future, I do tend to more focus on the positive outcomes, and I think that's part of a natural disposition. I don't know the things I don't know, and in the famous words of Donald Rumsfeld. So I think it does require thoughtful moral minds right now to be exploring and looking at some of these things, and research is being done, and I know that folks like Renata are being very careful about those things, and I think that's hugely important to bring into the dialogue. The neat thing is that it's easier to influence the design of these things because of their open nature, and the fact that we are publicly participating in building these things. It's not happening behind closed doors. You can actually see the code being constantly updated in the release cycle for those things. So there's a natural platform for dialogue there that didn't exist before.
Who could see this? I mean, you can see this probably. But, you know, when you talk about open society and democratic governance structures, there's a small group of people who are able to understand what's happening there. And that's I think, what we need to be concerned about, you know, and just make this much more inclusive.
Right. So technical and digital literacy is definitely a massive barrier to understanding things. It's, you know, I wouldn't go to, you know, my butcher for an explanation for how, you know, something's wrong with my body. I go to my physician. And so you have to have experts that are welcome to events to answer difficult questions and also explain how these things function. But the difference here that I think is really significant is this is not a black box. All of the code is open source for these projects unless it's deliberately not. And those are the ones where I have greater concern in terms of what the design principles are and who's behind it and why they're, you know, why they're making those choices.
Right.
It's hidden by complexity, and again, this is the inequality that I was trying to explain, and that's something that governments, especially G20 governments, can work on. If this remains, okay, you included some women in your club, you included some people from different countries, but this is really a super exclusive club, benefiting the few, not the many. And that's one of the key problems. It could be like a public asset. I mean, it's a technology that can be scaled and with the adequate public policy attached to it. It could lead to a lot of innovation, not only in the financial sector, but I feel that it was an opportunity that was somehow hijacked, and we need to take it right now back. Through different measures, for example, invest in digital social innovation. The European Union is doing it well, but if you compare the investment on this, it's like something like 5 million euro compared to any, like probably that's what the Commission spends on coffee breaks on the month of March. And other countries, if I think of India, if I think of Brazil, Mexico, and so on, are not investing in this. We can correct the gender imbalance. We can catch up. I mean, this is a very new technology, and I'm sure that in 3 years' time, with intense investment, we could have a more diversified pool of innovations that are not only on the private sector, and not only in the few countries that I mentioned.
Okay. Look, I've got questions coming in from the audience, and I do want to get to those as well. I am wary of our sort of constrained time. Forgive me for sounding really naive about this, but when we Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies, and I mentioned the wild fluctuations, in particular Bitcoin itself, in my open. Is it a twist that Bitcoins themselves are always going to be inherent to this process? You know, you're always going to have to, if I'm getting this right as well, reward the miners for doing what they do. So you can't get away from the crypto asset, the cryptocurrency.
So this is a good question. It probably requires a little bit of a longer answer, so I'll try and be brief. But basically, the way these networks operate is the people that maintain the integrity of them download a piece of software that runs on their computer, and for exchanging their computational use and the energy on their side, they're rewarded with newly minted value. So essentially, the network itself is kind of operating like a central bank, and the people that help keep track of the transactional history and securitize the network are rewarded for doing so. And so it's a completely new business model that didn't exist 8 years ago before this was invented. So the Bitcoin network was the first one to pioneer this. Now there's thousands of new ones. In the last year, there have been an explosion of completely new economic tests, and all of these are experimental, and they tinker with the economics, and they get to change how these things work, and we get to see what the benefits or the consequences of these things are. To me, if I were to have like one historical reference point for this, it'd be a little bit like we now have a new tool, the printing press, right? For thousands of years, some monks were the only people in the world that could create literature, and they wrote one book and one book only. And then one day, there was a tool that let anyone create narrative, and we had an explosion of stories and history and philosophy. And now we have a new tool that lets us design value and completely tinker and change the way we think about money. And so there's going to be a massive amount of competition in this space. Some of it will be driven by the public sector, some of it will be driven by the private sector, some of it will be driven by central banks that will explore the use of digital money because of the potential benefits it brings to their society. If money can move more fluidly and more quickly, it's good for countries. The countries can tax the revenue more easily, they can graph it more conveniently for all the statistical research they need to do. They'll have real-time optics into how money is moving and flowing through their economies. So we live in an age that's digital. It makes sense to me that money would become digital, and on this pathway there will be lots of experimentation. Now, whether or not Bitcoin is around in 100 years, I don't know the answer to that. But it will be remembered for sparking a significant amount of innovation in how we think about value, and that will be what I think it'll be remembered for.
Pierre, a question comes in from our audience, which I think is really for you. Should blockchain technology be an answer for I guess, building social networks, and should it be an answer for issues with data privacy? You know, but both of which your Reconnect platform addresses.
In order to respect the privacy of information, more from the human part, I mean, we are, since the beginning of the project, we are close to the NGO, to the social centers that provide the accommodation to the beneficiaries. And we want to ensure that the information will stay at the level of the social structure, at the level of the people that the beneficiaries trust. We think this is fundamental. For the rest of the technology, I can answer clearly about that question, but what we want to do is clearly respect what is done on the field, what is done by the social structure. I mean, before we started to deploy our solution, papers were stored in cabinet line here in the social shelter. So we are just digitalizing that part of their work, and we want information to be safely exchanged between people that the beneficiaries trust. And I think the challenge that we have is to work on the exchange of information between those social structure and the government, because the administration delivers the social benefits, and this is where we have to work, and we have to respect the rules from the social shelter that provide the accommodation.
Okay. Look, I'm just going to mention a polling question that we're going to pose to you in about 5 minutes or so. So have a think about it. Do you believe blockchain technology has a truly transformative potential beyond the financial sector? Yes, no, or I don't know is going to be the question. I'm being told I've got 30 minutes left. Maybe that's maybe I have got 30 minutes left. But let's get back just on the, before we throw that out and look at your responses to that. Let's get back to the other ways in which this can be used. You know, aid is one. You know, empowering refugees, educating refugees, voting systems you've talked about. We saw it used in the Colombia peace plebiscite. I think it was used. Energy grids, etc. Throw a few more applications for this out there that might excite this audience.
I don't know if anyone's excited about tuna fish, but I got a good one for you. So the World Economic Forum, in cooperation with some large manufacturers and supply chains, are looking at the use of blockchain technology in respect to tuna fish. And let me explain how they're doing this. So it's actually kind of sad, but tuna is one of the most overfished species on the planet, and there are a bunch of different regimes that govern how much yield can be pulled out of the ocean at different times. And so it's really hard to keep track of what's actually moving to market, where it came from, and whether or not it moved to market in a compliant way. But if you have the ability to use sensors and record information as it moved to market, you'd have some pretty interesting things you could do, not only with better price discovery, but tracking of the provenance of where the tuna fish comes from. And so you can imagine a scenario where you go to your local Tesco or Sainsbury's, you scan a photo of the fish and the QR code on the packaging, and it actually shows you a complete history that's publicly verifiable all the way back to Captain Jack Sparrow that caught the fish in the South Pacific. And you'd be able to see that it moved to market, it hit the right temperatures, and that it did it in a quick and transparent way. And so that has absolutely nothing to do with tuna fish, by the way. The point is to demonstrate that you could have transparency across supply chains for everything from fish to rare earth minerals to woods that are endangered species, all kinds of things. And so that application is pretty neat. I didn't know much about tuna fish until recently.
Despite the warnings we heard from you, or at least the caution, what excites you in the future?
Well, there's obviously more examples like that, and what excites me at the moment is that the discussion is going beyond cryptocurrencies. You know, we've been discussing Bitcoin and Ethereum and whatnot, but of course there is much more in that technology. Another example, for instance, Greenpeace, which is one of our member organizations, is trying to use blockchain for the social contracts that they do with big corporates. They make a deal with a big corporate. They say, you have committed to make all kind of changes to your supply chain, to the way you do business, and then Greenpeace is trying to hold them accountable. Now, at the moment, this is very, very cumbersome, because if you do that for a number of large corporates, you are flooded with an amount of data that is very difficult to process, not even especially not in real time. If you use blockchain, in theory, you have a technology that gives you immediately information about what works and what doesn't, and gives you, on the other side, then the option, to sanction this or to say, no, we had a contract, this is not happening. So stuff like that, I think, is very, very exciting. It involves, of course, now institutions that are literate, and that's where, you got to allow me, that's where, and that's why, Mr. Macron this afternoon talked about, 3 big issues out there, and one of them being inequality. If we don't address inequality with new technologies, we're failing big time. The 1 billion people that are being left behind cannot be left behind with a rapid technological development. That's one of the dangers.
Just again, looking over these questions, and a bunch of them address ethical issues, issues of security, et cetera, et cetera. Are we further ahead on these issues than we were last year or the year before, Nick, when we sat on this stage and talked about blockchain? Renato, let me throw it to you first. Are we moving ahead with this? Are we seeing positive development here, or are we going to be sitting here next year asking exactly the same questions about this?
Well, we are in the summer of the Facebook apology and the Mark Zuckerberg sorry tour.
Is that how you refer to the summer now?
And I think that the problem is that the PR around these technologies is getting sharper and sharper and shinier, and we are not getting deep into the issues. For example, no one has answered yet my question: how do I delete a piece of revenge porn or child porn? out of the ledger. And those are like the ugly stories that no one wants to publish about. I mean, you see the emergence of all these parallel industry of certifications on the blockchain, certified speaker on the blockchain, popping up everywhere, and lots of journalists, even magazines, absolutely dedicated to this. And we are not discussing the very fundamentals of these technologies, and we are not doing it. I mean, we don't even have. We have organizations like the United Nations that, as we know, have very limited resources, experimented in public-private alliances with these technologies, but this it is on the fringes. It hasn't taken the principles and the implications, the dangers and the benefits. Are still, I'm still waiting for them to take a central stage and a serious conversation and actions.
So how do you respond to Renata when she asks this question? And I think it's fair for me to say, Nick, and I don't blame you in many ways, you sound exasperated sometimes when you defend this against this sort of criticism. But how do you respond to that?
I mean, these are the same criticisms that were used against the internet 25 years ago.
Exactly. And a question comes through, by the way, exactly on that.
And so I don't think they're without legitimacy, and I'm not trying to say that. It's just that we already are working through the governance issues of how to manage these things with the web. I'm not a legal policy expert on those things, and so I think I would defer to organizations like the one you work for to help provide guidance for how best to do that. The technology by design is immutable, secure, verifiable, resilient, and transparent. Radical transparency is not great for everything. And so that has specific implications. There are now a whole continuum of different types of blockchains, though. You've got public ledger technologies that act a lot more like a global utility that anyone can use. And then you've got hybrid versions, and then you've got private ones. And those different technologies can be used for different use cases. And so you kind of have to fit to purpose them. It's not a panacea. It's not like blockchain fixes everything. It has use cases. It's better than other capabilities that are existent in centralized use cases. And so I think when I think about the role that governments have really in all of this in terms of building a more equal playing field, it's not about cajoling or coercing the developers and the engineers and the scientists that are working on these things and telling them what the science should be. It's about building up capacity on an educational level so that more people can participate in that discovery process. So that's where I'd be focused on the public policy side, is making sure that countries are tooling their citizenry to be more digitally fluent as much as they can.
All right. It's interesting. It's almost remiss of a finance minister or an economy minister to talk in public without mentioning digitalization or blockchain or regulation of this, et cetera, et cetera. Which countries, which governments are doing a really good job of this? And I know we've talked to the Swedish Central Bank before about what they're doing, and there's some really progressive moves being made. But on the other hand, there are central bankers who still express extreme skepticism.
Yeah, and to the point that this isn't, I think there are valid criticisms about how technocratic this is. And certainly in the early days, the only people that understood this were a few dozen cryptographers, and the number of people that can claim to have expertise in that is quite limited. But this is not a phenomena that is localized to San Francisco. I have flown well over 1 million miles in the last year, and there are people and communities all over the planet that are working on building technologies to solve all these interesting use cases, some of them financial, some of them not. And that to me is really inspiring. And so, long term, we need to build broader community if we're going to use this technology in an open, fair way. And I think we're making steps toward that. The first community that formed here was extremely technical. Now, a lot of the people that participate come from the financial services sector or worked in NGOs, and they're bringing their decades of experience, and we needed that the whole time. But it wasn't interesting enough for years before those people came to participate. And so we're at that point now. And I do think this will take a long time, in the same way that we're still talking about the internet, even though it's 2018. We'll be talking about these tools for a long time to come.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a reality check. 25% of people are connected actually in Africa. So 75% of a continent, the youngest continent, is disconnected to the internet 30 years after the invention of it. So
And
when
when
you
we talk
say,
about scaling, I mean,
yes,
that's a problem.
exactly. There's not even electricity in many countries, and I mean that's one a reality check when you say, oh yes, people all over the world are like contributing to this technology. I don't know which is your mappa mundi, because in mine. There's a huge exclusion and big gaps. I mean, for instance, to be up the top to this, you even have to have access in your language of the tools to become capable, and electricity and daily calories. I mean, it's
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Wolfgang. Give us your comment on that, and a final comment, because I know you've got to shoot off. But
You know, I have the benefit of having experienced the birth of the internet when I was a young adult, and there was a lot of excitement and curiosity, and there was not much kind of criticism. Oh my gosh, what is happening there? Actually, quite the opposite. And as the internet progressed, you know, with social media coming on and the like, we missed out on strengthening the institutions, for instance, that Renata stands for, you know, the World Wide Web Foundation or the Internet Governance Forum or ICANN, whatever. I mean, the internet is being governed, but very weakly. And we have not managed to keep pace in terms of governance with a technology that is exciting, that brings all kind of opportunities and the like. And why is that so? Your question, which countries are doing well, is probably the wrong one, because we are working with phenomena which cannot be governed by the traditional governments, I mean national governments. And we haven't figured out the multilateral kind of international global mechanisms that can help, you know, benefit and utilize what's coming out here and making sure that things don't go out of hand. So that's a big task that we better start engaging in right away.
It's like asking whether or not you want a central authority to manage the world's military. And I think it's important to make that point, which is that, like, if you centralize control over things that manage everybody's lives on the planet, you've missed the whole point of this technology, which was to completely disintermediate and distribute that. And so I would challenge that, like, the answer here isn't to run to some sort of central mechanism that we trust in the fallacy of man to figure all this stuff out. Because if you put all of that power in one place, I assure you it will attract some negative power-hungry people, and that's concerning to me. So the internet is by design difficult to manage and control and put in a box, and that's a good thing to a certain extent. It means that it's more difficult for one country or another to unilaterally decide what we all get to see or not see. And so just like information is now distributed all over the world, and if someone does have access to a phone, and I will surrender the point there, because if you don't have that and you're worried about putting food on your plate, then you can't even begin to worry about these things. But the reality is that there are startups in Nairobi that I've met, in Lagos in South Africa, that are doing cool work on these things that wouldn't have been able to do these things a decade and a half ago. And that's inspirational to me. And so, you know, we're going to make progress.
sorry, I laugh because Renata's not just shaking her head; she's rolling her eyes. Maybe you guys should we'll put you in a room together. You know, you can hash this one out. Pierre, you wanted to come in with something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's very important to keep the contact with those people you want to address. Still, I will repeat what I said before, but there is a lot of business like, okay, we will solve the problem, and then we want to monetize the data, and we want to do whatever we want to get the business grow, etc., etc. But since the beginning, we have this user-centric approach. We do want to have a different business model. We do not want to monetize the information, especially with that kind of population, which the data is very sensitive. Actually, when you go, for example, in a gymnasium during the winter to provide the service to open an account for a beneficiary, actually he's giving all his life, all his document, all his history, and we have to care about that. We have to care for their position. They have the right to cancel whatever they want. We cannot keep the data behind. We have to deal with the NGO that manages the population. That's very important. We cannot address the population only. We have to understand how NGO address the population to have something smart. And finally, we have to deal with the government and the administration, because this is where the benefits is coming for our beneficiaries.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is the polling question. We're going to take a look at what you've said to this. Do you believe blockchain technology has a truly transformative potential beyond the financial sector? Yes, no, or I don't know. If you could vote on that. There you go. So almost 60% of you are saying yes. You know, I don't think there's any great surprise there. I think the I don't know is maybe a little bit surprising. I don't know. Let's react quickly to that.
I think that the I don't know is the opportunity, and I don't know is the message of all the G20 countries to invest in research, to explore more, and to invest in education as well, to explore together more, and to give people agency, and so they can participate in this and answer whether there's opportunities or it's just a fancy technology that will not go any further.
Yeah. Is that the message from that? Wolfgang, Nick, anyone?
Completely agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's great to see that the I don't know is pretty low, I would say. I mean, usually you'd say the I don't have a clue, and this kind of situation would be much higher. So either Nick and the panel has done a great job in explaining what it is, or people come into that space with much more knowledge, which is encouraging.
Good.
Because we need this kind of collective knowledge to get hold of it.
All right, look, what I'm going to do, we've got a few minutes, and I've got to invite Greg Medcraft from the OECD up to give a few closing remarks. Is there any really burning question that anyone has in our audience for the panel? Yep, there's a lady here, and we'll take this question. All right, we're going to take this question, and we're going to take this question. We're going to make them really tight if we can, and then I'll hand it over to Greg. Go ahead. It might be on, actually. Might be on.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, so quick question about China. So the first question is the initiatives in China about blockchain research really collaborative? Like, is this open source spirit really beyond borders? First question. And second question, we have in China, as I see it, a state which is very much involved in this question, and trying also to work on the social impact. So there's been a crackdown on cryptocurrencies, and also wish to integrate some blockchain technology into public services. So is China some kind of inspiration for the global community also on this kind of regulation aspect?
Okay, so is China an inspiration? Let's just take this question as well. Go ahead.
I don't know. Is it working?
Yeah, go ahead.
It is. Okay. Anne Duncan. I'm non-executive director on a number of boards, but I'm here with the International Women's Forum today. I would just like to ask a question. OECD, this question is very much about governance, and it's primarily to Mr. Carey, because OECD has come out for years now in developing models of how good governance can be put in place in various organizations. In the early stages, very often you have companies like in stages of development of a domain, you have companies that don't really address good governance. They don't know a lot about it, actually. I'm just wondering if you would be willing to yourself build that into the model of what you have by inviting in NGOs, by looking at accountability. If I look on LinkedIn, you've got 9 people who are employees. They're all men, and they're all from New York, California, or London. You know, those are the kinds of things that create transparency, that is what builds trust. And institutional trust is important, but so is company trust when you're in this early stage. And I believe that's the message that Emmanuel Macron was trying to send to the technology leaders who came to town. And I think that that's one of the things you could build in that would get us all more on your side.
Okay, Nick, deal with that one.
Probably best
first,
I hit that one first. So great question. So I want to make a quick distinction that my company is called blockchain.com, which is frequently confused with the Core Innovation, which is a public source project of which there are many derivatives. And so there are thousands of different blockchains, all of which are contributed to by open source communities. And we provide academic funding to support some of that research and development that goes into those open source projects. So the governance of how code gets deployed is all managed through a peer review process. It's similar to how an academic paper is published in a journal or something like that. On the company side, we're structured just like any other major company would be. Now, we don't have 9 employees, so I don't know why that's what you found around. We actually have hundreds of employees, New York, Washington, London, and San Francisco. And I'm actually really proud of how many women we have in the company. We have 3 women that serve on our executive committee, and we have probably one of the highest ratios of females in any tech company in the world. Now, that's by design. If you walk across any of our offices, you will find probably people speaking in 6 or 7 different languages. The way we think about recruitment and building our team is about building an open, inclusive community. And so I appreciate the opportunity to address that because unfortunately, the quick discovery was inaccurate.
Okay, who wants to grab the China question? Inspiration?
So China doesn't inspire me very much in that particular space. And when you look at what they're doing with social media, the Sesame Credit kind of system they're trying to, that's scary in a way. And China is one of the 190 states in the world. When you look at an annually published index on civil rights and the ability to exercise your rights as a citizen, where these rights are being seriously shrinking. There's only about 12 countries which have like a green civic space rating in the world, and US is not one of them. And that means that, everything that is happening in the digital space is either misused, abused in terms of control and matters like that, or being restricted, and that's the scary thing. I think open source, open democracy, and open society are great concepts, but there's many countries, an increasing number of countries, which don't allow for that, and we got to keep that in mind. And China is not an inspiring case.
Okay. Very quickly.
I think that it's not, we know very little on what's going on there, and we need to establish bridges urgently because when as a society that has centralized control over the people starts playing with these technologies, then this is a glimpse, is a window to a future once this, as our democracy is not getting any better globally. So maybe we can learn from the experience, connect with academics. I think that that's the way, connect and try to get them to open up a little bit the research of what they are doing so we can take preemptive steps not to replicate horrors.
I hate to do this, but I've got to end it there. Renata, Nick, Pierre, and Wolfgang, thank you for that dynamic discussion. And hopefully we got into some of the issues, the important issues you wanted answered. Greg Metcalf from the OECD joins us to give us just a few brief closing remarks.
So thank you, everybody. I guess this has been a very interesting discussion. Hearing about blockchain's potential, it's clearly something the OECD, particularly my directorate, we've been leading, and it's one of the things as Chairman of the Australian Securities Commission, we just oversaw the implementation of blockchain in clearing and settlement for 2 million accounts on the stock exchange. So it does hold huge potential. Your question on China, China is about 2 to 3 years ahead of the rest of the world on blockchain. So even if you don't agree with it, you better understand it because it's coming, okay? So it is coming, and China represents what, 40% of the world's GDP, or will. So, and they are way ahead, and I've seen it firsthand. So does hold huge potential. The secure transfer of value, data, and just the identity, which is you've touched upon. What we're seeing here is really focused in 3 areas. In financial services, you're talking about supply chain is incredible. It's amazing what with supply chain. In terms of things you talked about, provenance, and in our responsible business conduct area, we're seeing incredible potential with actually the issue of provenance in terms of people are concerned not just about where their food comes from. The Chinese are obviously very concerned, but you talked about the World Wildlife Fund has got their tuna project, but equally people are concerned where their clothing or whatever comes from, and the ability of blockchain to be able to actually verify whether the people were paid fairly in terms of the labour to collect the cotton, or they were actually polluting the Ganges River in terms of that tannery. People actually care about it. So it actually has a lot of potential in supply chain, giving access to businesses in countries that are part of that supply chain to be paid, not just fairly, but also quickly for when things happen. So supply chain, and then thirdly, the other area is government. So we are looking at this across OECD. It touches almost every part of OECD and its potential transformation. I do think what's very clear from your discussion, what I do think is the future of Bitcoin is extremely, extremely limited. I think we will see really the development of what they call permission blockchains, which don't involve the crazy use of electricity, etc., where basically people actually know one another and trust one another. But what's been interesting about this discussion is that, is discussing how it could transform economies and societies. We've raised a lot of questions. That's what we do at OECD. We raise questions, we try and identify solutions. Policy makers have a role in answering these questions, and the ultimate impact of blockchain will depend upon creating a policy environment that actually harvests the benefits while mitigating the risks. And we've had a lot of discussion about the risks. We can't go into this without understanding there are risks, but it is happening. International cooperation is critical. We heard about multilateralism from President Macron. It's critical. I mean, it's global, this technology. So what we've got to do is make sure that it is interoperable, that it should result in more inclusion. We've got to make sure that it doesn't result in exclusion. We've got to make sure that it doesn't result in fragmentation. And these are the questions, probably raises even more questions of why we need to work together. So, the OECD, I believe, does have a role to play here. I think, first of all, what we're doing today is part of that role, is we provide a forum for discussion, to pool knowledge and experience of government, of industry, of researchers and other stakeholders to understand the issues and identify good practices in governments. And that's what we're here today to actually hear. And it's what we had a conference 2 weeks ago on digital financial assets, 60 countries, IMF, World Bank, etc., 200 people to talk about digital financial assets and every aspect of it, of them. Standard setting by applying existing standards or adapting existing standards and principles to these developments are going to be very important. I think we need to think in a digital world, not in an analogue world, and I think that is where perhaps standards needs to catch up. But there are big issues here. Privacy was being touched on. Taxation's another massive issue in terms of blockchain, in terms of the initial coin offering market. Market integrity, I mean, basically, these do need to be regulated, okay? That's the debate we're having at the moment, that, trust and confidence, regulation actually enables trust and confidence. And I think a lot of these startups need to appreciate that it can actually help them. Competition, again, make sure it's not exclusionary. Dealing with illegal money flows, again, Bitcoin, anti-money laundering is an issue. Consumer investment protection is important. And then obviously cybersecurity is critical. So there are a lot of issues. It's about having the forum. It is about thinking about standard setting. And then thirdly, the comment was made, it's about capacity building. Okay, it's capacity building, helping governments to better understand how they can, what the issue is here and how they can respond. It's one of the things we're meeting with ministers, finance ministers, etc., governments. They want to understand about what the technology is about and what's the best way to respond to it. So, and I think we will be exploring these issues. We've done it today. We're going to do it in a few weeks' time with industry. And what we are doing is we are having a major blockchain conference in September 4th and 5th, and the details will be available very soon. And I invite anyone who's interested to join us, because I do think that distributed ledger blockchain, I think, will really be significant in reshaping the world and also bringing benefits in terms of disintermediation and more efficiency and hopefully better lives and better policies. Thank you. Thank you to our panellists.
So Nick, the car, is waiting. I've got to just go grab my bag. Thanks, Axel. Pleasure. Thanks.